So I think the best place to start off, I felt, is his first Commando cover, which was circa 1970. Because I think it's a real good example of the first use of acrylic paint and how he actually applied that paint. It's quite a thick render of paint. And as the years went by, Ian started to kind of water down that process and build it up a bit more. But I think this is a really great example of a really solid and dynamic cover, which is what he became known for. And during his career, as many of you will know, he did well over 1,000 or 1,500 covers for Commando, which is an incredibly impressive feat. And between this cover here and this one here, there's 52 years between them, which is really quite astounding, really. And there's no loss of technique or detail or anything in here, and the technique is still there. Although, like I said, he developed a technique which was more kind of watered down, but no less vibrant, I would say. Which brings us to these pieces here, which are amazing to see because, considering when they date from, they're still very, very vibrant colours. They still really, really hold up, and they look like they're actually prints. They're so well conceived and painted. But what's interesting about the top one is that actually Ian did 5 internal issues of Commando as well, in black and white. But these are 63-page, epics. They're a lot of work. And I would recommend, if anyone's interested in hunting down those 5 issues, I can tell you exactly what issues they are later on if you're interested. If we just move over here a little bit, we're going to just go quickly around. I'm not going to go around everything. I'll let you have a look in your own time. This is a more recent set of artwork for Commando. I think what's interesting about this is that this was focused on one family, and there was different perspectives from the family. So Ian created these characters based on the stories. It's called The Week's War, and I think this is something that's quite unusual for Commando to do, kind of a continuing story or a theme or a story arc within here. But what I love about this is that the border here, it seems very strange when you look at it in context of a piece of artwork. It's actually where the border of the page was on the cover, and you'll see that a few times in these kind of wrap-around covers where they actually wrap around the extent of the publication. We move over here. This is quite an interesting one actually, because this just happened to be in the portfolio, and again quite a recent piece of work, I think from 2022 actually. And this just happened to be in the portfolio of work which we were given. But what struck me about this is how close the final colours are to the coloured pencil rough. This is the rough, by the way. It's actually this could have actually gone in as the cover just about. It's that well detailed. And as his career went on, Ian used coloured pencils more and more for some of the roughs, where before he would just do a very simple pencil sketch, which we'll see some examples of when we go over to the other side. And there's a few more examples here that are outside of DC Thompson work, which is quite interesting because Ian's career really transcended publishers and decades. And really, he's more best known for work for DC Thompson, but he worked for IPC, and it was Amalgamated Press at the start, which became Fleetway in London. And these are some examples of brands which basically spun off into series. And this one came back a few years ago called Johnny Red. I think it's really interesting that they commissioned Ian to do these 2 front covers for this American format comic. What's really interesting as well is that the writer, Garth Ennis, a very big name in comics, was a huge fan of Ian's work and went on to commission another piece of work, which is up here, which is the piece of work which is in the poster for the show, from Into the Blue. And it's a fantastic series of covers that Ian did, and I got to know these pieces of art very well because I scanned them in for Ian when I used to work at the art college, and I thought it was great to be able to see these, in the flesh, something you don't often get the opportunity to see, which is why this exhibition is so great. I'm going to come back to this one at the end of the talk because there's a story about that. So if we move around to the middle section next. As I said before, if we just come around this section here, Ian's probably best known for his amazing dynamic cover work, and he was brilliant at that. But he was also brilliant at the interior art as well. And this is a really good example of and some pages from 2000 AD. This is from a story called Invasion, which was in issue 16, I think, of 26 of 2000 AD. And what's really great about this set is that we've got the whole set here. The scale of it, I think, is really interesting, how big he drew compared to the final page. But the other thing that was really interesting is that the writer, Chris Lauder, we were at an event 6 years ago now in London, which was the 40th anniversary of 2000 AD, and Ian was doing a panel, and he was just talking about the early days of 2000 AD. So this is in 1977, and someone shouted out in the audience, and it happened to be the writer of this story, and they'd never met for over 40 years, because Ian would occasionally go down to London and meet the staff down there, but mostly this was done remotely, and this was all done in his studio in just outside Dundee. And you also notice as well, though, which would never happen now, is the lettering was pasted straight on to the artwork, which in my eyes is a bit of a crime, to be honest, because you're covering up a lot of really interesting work. But as time goes on with these older pieces of art, you'll see that you can actually you can now see through the lettering because it kind of degraded. But to see this, I mean, I first saw this piece of work probably about 5 years ago, and I had no idea that Ian had this work. This work seemed to have been lost in time. IPC actually threw a lot of artwork out in the 80s, and only some of it was retained, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go a bit further around as well. But just have a close look at the penmanship on here, and also the use of the zip tones, it's called, the dots in there, which is all cut out by hand and stuck on, just to give it that extra depth. Not that it really needed it, but because the pen work was absolutely astounding, and the compositions as well. Something he always instilled in my students. So Ian used to do classes for me, and at art college in comics, and he was always over the page layouts. He didn't like the traditional grid layout. He liked to really make it dynamic and still read and still flow. But he was a master of not just the drawing, but the layout as well, which is a whole art in itself of how you tell a story across 5 pages and make it dynamic, but also make it clear enough that you understand what's going on. And there's no doubt that you know exactly what's going on in this story here. So we'll move on to another example of this. And, again, similar, but this one goes back to the very start of 2000 AD. It's called Prog 2, which is issue 2. And you can see by the age of it again, some of the letterings kind of sort of peeling away. There's nothing to do about that. But I thought it was interesting when I saw this piece of work that there's a big chunk taken out of it, and essentially that's because they had inset there a kind of background to the story, and obviously at some point someone's just cut it out and stuck it on another page, so there was no kind of layering of Photoshop back in the day. But what's interesting about this piece of work in Prog 2 is that was the debut of Judge Dredd in 2000 AD, and it's a character that most people wouldn't associate Ian with. He's mostly associated with aeronautical work, or Commando, or even Star Blazer, but actually he did end up doing quite a lot of work on the Judge, as he called him, Judge Dredd, and becoming friends with the co-creator of Judge Dredd, John Wagner, and we'll see an example of that as we just move down here. I'd encourage you to have a look in the cabinets as well when you get a chance, because there's lots of other things that you might not be aware of that Ian did, including the Lookers Air Show covers, and there's also some work which was done for the family, which is fantastic as well. And there's some pictures of Ian's days when he was on staff at DC Thompson, which I think is definitely worth having a look at, because it was kind of run like a school in a way. That's how they trained in-house. And Ian did that for about 5 years before he became freelance, and remained freelance until the end of his career. So we'll just move on up here. If you have another look at the sequential work first, this is actually the only example of Ian drawing Judge Dredd as a full strip. And back when this was getting published, circa 1996, 95, 96, 2000 AD was printed on very low-grade paper. It was letterpress, it's called, so the colour work didn't really hold up, so it was all done in black and white. but the double page spreads would be coloured. It's a kind of mechanical process. It's done by hand, but then it's printed with very flat colour. So that's why we have this quite unusual double page spread that was in the middle of the comic, which would be coloured by the letterer, in this case Tom Frame. And then the rest of the pages would be in black and white. And I remember having a conversation with Ian about Judge Dredd, because at this point in time, Ian wasn't a very big fan of Judge Dredd. He didn't like the subject matter. He felt it was ultra violent, which it was. It didn't really sort of chime with him. But interestingly enough, as the years went by, he kind of warmed to the character, and latterly this character became his favourite character. And an example of where that evolved to, if we look over this side, we have a much more recent example of Ian tackling Judge Dredd, and this is really interesting because this is 2015, this is like 30 years later from the last example. But the detail on this is a double page spread, the actual comic's in here, so it wraps around the issue. It's also beside another wraparound cover that he did in the 80s, so you can see the contrast when you've got the black and white version that's that's physically coloured, and then you have this amazing piece of work which is again using his acrylic technique. But the level of detail on this is just incredible. I mean, I just can't quite fathom where you begin with this. It's just so detailed. I encourage you to have a look at it. But here's the roughs as well, so you've got the very, very rough thumbnail up here. You have it blocked out to get a sense of the composition, and then you have the final cover. And that's something that always struck me about Ian's work, was the composition. He had this innate ability to know where the logo was going to go and all the cover furniture, as it's known, and it never never encroached on the artwork, and vice versa. So he was absolutely excellent at blocking in covers. So I think this is great that this piece is intact to show the whole process. And this was incredibly popular cover, to the point where Rebellion, here, the current publishers of 2000 AD, allowed Ian to sell this as a print at comic shows across the UK, which I'll talk about just now. So I was lucky enough to accompany Ian to lots of shows until Ian's son Neil would start accompanying him to shows, particularly the one in Leeds he liked, called Thought Bubble. But the first one we ever did, and the first one Ian did, which was a proper Comic Con, was down in Edgbaston, down in Birmingham. So we had to spend the day getting down there, and then we set up the show on the Saturday morning, and we did the weekend, and we came back up to Scotland on the Sunday night, and that was an incredible weekend because it's the first time that Ian was aware of his fan base and how big it was. And I'm not just talking about fans who read the comics, I'm talking about the other guests who were at the Comic Con, the other creators who he'd influenced over the years. It was incredible. Multiple people coming up to the table who I recognise as big names in comics, who cited Ian as their biggest influence, and they couldn't quite believe he was at the show. And ultimately, that was the start of an almost 10-year commitment to going to Comic Cons, and he absolutely loved meeting his fans and other creators at those shows. And it was great that he discovered it quite late, but he certainly made the most of it. Once he did discover it, you almost couldn't stop Ian going to the Comic Cons in the end. So yeah, that was great to get him into that scene. And then what he'd also do off the back end of that is these commissions. So this is where he became to kind of love the judge in a way. So I don't know if a lot of you are aware how Comic Cons work, but often, if you like an artist, you could commission them to do a piece of work, either do it at the show, or you might commission them and they go away and they do it a few months later. And Ian amassed a huge list of commission lists, basically, over the years. But what he also did, which was very, very savvy, is he created a whole portfolio of work that was just for selling at Comic Cons, original art. And he developed this style where it was just in black and white, a little wash on it, a little splash of colour. And these were incredibly popular because they were also very reasonably priced as well. And they kind of flew off the shelves at these Comic Cons, so a lot of people were able to get an original piece of work by Ian Kennedy. But obviously the more detail and colour and complexity, the higher the price went. But this was great to see this, because I know very few comic artists who put that amount of effort into commissions at shows. You know, I've never really seen anything quite like it, and there was a huge portfolio of work that he would take from show to show, and also tackle on characters that he'd never really drawn before. So I think that's what's really interesting. He's known for certain characters, one of whom we'll come on to in a minute. But I think the ones that astounded me and astounded a lot of other fans of Ian was the ones that you didn't expect him to draw. You know, and he still was able to capture that, and still made that work. And it just meant to me that this is someone who could draw anything and make it look so dynamic and effortless. It often wasn't effortless, but he's one of those people who could draw anything. You put a brief down in front of him and he'd be able to produce it to this kind of standard, which is fantastic. So if we just have a look over here, and maybe Matthew could help me out here, because this is some of Matthew's choices for the show. These came directly from DC Thompson, and this is a particular favourite of mine from Starblazer. Maybe you want to just have a quick
I mean, Starblazer was obviously started in the late 70s, when, you know, DC Thompson were trying to jump on the science fiction bandwagon with all the popularity of Star Wars and so on. And they're just really stunning images, and I basically just looked through all the ones that he'd done. I just said, can I have that, and that? And they were able to find them all, which was fantastic. And I particularly love these kind of early ones, you know, because I think he had this great love of drawing airplanes, that then sort of naturally moved on to his great love of drawing spaceships in the same kind of detail and realism, and you really get the sense that these are actual real worlds, and the vehicles are real, and they could actually fly. You know, there's just a sort of kind of reality to them.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing to say is, as Starblazer went on, it kind of shifted more towards sort of fantasy. Obviously, the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons and fighting fantasy and so on in that time. And so there's a kind of real shift in the work. But again, as you were saying, you know, Ian was just able to do anything really, and so you get some amazing kind of fantasy landscapes and so on.
But Matthew's reminded me there that you're absolutely right. Everything looked like it should work, even if it was flung into the future. And especially the Dan Dare stuff, which we'll look at in a minute, he did let slip to me, and I think a lot of people know this story, that some of the components were drawn out of a Reader's Digest manual for Hoover parts. So if you look carefully, you might see some Hoover parts in here. But everything felt real. I think that was what was brilliant about Ian's work. It was grounded in reality. As you can see, even from these pieces of work, and even the fantasy pieces here as well, which again, fantastic colours as well. Remember, you're mixing these colours up by hand. It's not a colour picker in Photoshop, which is what we all use now. This is mixing up physical colour and making sure it all works, and again, a natural ability to match colours and to use colour theory without even really thinking about it, which is incredible, really. So we'll just move on to these Dan Dare pieces. These are personal favourite of mine. This is when I first came across Ian's work, to be honest. It's the Dan Dare strip here, which is this huge centre spread piece from the New Eagle. Ian started drawing this in 1982, and he was on that strip for about two years solid, producing this type of work every week. This is a weekly comic. So that is incredible, that level of detail. But he actually had history with Dan Dare that goes back to the original Dan. Although this was actually the 2000 AD Dan Dare. Not many people know that he drew that as well. This was in an annual, and this version of Dan Dare was very 1970s. He had a leather jacket on. He was a bit tougher. He wasn't quite the same character. He even acquired a kind of superhero outfit and hand in this era of work. But for me, this 1980s version, who's actually the great grandson of the original Dan, was where Ian really excelled, and the script really played up to Ian's strengths, because Pat Mills, the writer and creator of 2000 AD, kind of wrote this, when he knew Ian was on board, he wrote it for Ian, so he built in all this future NASA stuff, and played up on Ian's amazing tech. And you can see here, you know, you've got a proto space shuttle here, and just all the little details in here are just so ahead of its time. I considering this is from 1982, it doesn't look dated at all. I think the design ethic of this is outstanding, incredible. And this is the first episode of a strip called Fireflight, and this is when, for me, it really took on a whole new lease of life, because the colour palettes he was using, the spaceship design, the Firefly itself, which is what the story was about at this point. I'd never seen anything quite like this in comics. You know, it was just a breath of fresh air. You know, we're not talking about black and white letterpress. We're talking about full colour. You know, the printing could actually handle that. And for me, this for me was his peak of science fiction work. Sequential work as well. It wasn't just a case of drawing a single image, this is telling a story again. And again, incredible that he could do that on a weekly basis. And you know, a personal favourite of mine as well, the Mekon character here, which is the villain in Dundee. This was an amazing opportunity we had where Ian agreed to do a live demo of his work for our students, and we were going to film it. And I interviewed him as he was painting it, and it was incredible to see that process and how you could actually talk and paint at the same time. It's not as easy as it sounds. So that was a fantastic night. He actually did this twice. We did 2 nights in a row as part of the Literary Festival that year. And there's actually a video of that online as well, which we'll be playing during the run of the exhibition when it's open for the next month and a half or so. But it's also online on 2000 AD's website as well. If you do a search for 2000 AD Ian Kennedy, it should come up for you because it was done in real time. So you can see again, this was done, you know, 30, 40 years after the original, but the detail is still there. And the fact he was able to do that live in front of an audience is quite incredible, I think. Okay, and one last sequential piece, and we'll just wrap that up. But if we just have a look here, this is kind of like a combination of all the worlds, if you want. So this was for 2000 AD. Again, this is a feature shock. This is a one and done. It's a kind of twist in the tail. 4 pages. And but the writer, Kelvin Gosnell, knew that Ian really liked the aeronautical stuff, so he wrote it into the script. And this is kind of like one of the most well-regarded future shocks that there's ever been in 2000 AD, for good reason, because just look at it. I mean, it's an incredible piece of work. These were sort of seen as filler pieces in between the bigger stories. But this one really played to Ian's strengths, and as you can see in the final page here, you have a kind of all these old aeroplanes and the detail of that, and I bet they're all accurate as well. This is just like, for me, one of my favourite pieces of work, and I could not believe that Ian actually had this in his collection. He must have rescued it from a skip somewhere down at Fleetway, because the scale of it is even bigger than the other work. And I think that penmanship in there was incredible. So we're very lucky to have this in the show.
Speaking of accuracy, he's captured you really nicely.
When I was here, if we move back over, I just want to talk finally about one of the last pieces of work that Ian worked on. So that's a very brief overview. Where do you start? Where do you end? Ian was so prolific. This is still a snapshot of his career and his work. I don't know anyone, or probably there never will be someone who could produce that amount of work for this industry. I mean, it's an incredible feat to work on that solidly for over 70 years. It's just incredible, But one of the last pieces that Ian did was something that was quite close to his heart, and we're lucky to have this piece here in the exhibition. And this is from a book called Coming Home, which the publishers actually kindly set up some books to give away, so if we could form an orderly queue at the end, that'd be great. But just to show you in context, so this was the original artwork, and this was the final piece of work as seen in the comic. And it's gone all around the world, essentially. This is an American format, and for a very worthy cause, and I encourage you, if you don't grab a free copy of this, which was very kindly sent up by the charity, then the details of the charity are on the card beside the painting. But I just wanted to show you this because it kind of just feels like it's full circle, and still you can see how incredible Ian's work was here in person. So thanks very much for your time, and yeah, and please have a nice look around the show in your own time and pace. And if you want to ask me any questions, I'll be over and about as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much.